let's start with the big picture. AI is here, it's game-changing, and it affects businesses, states, politics, and the world going into elections. So at the big scene in global geopolitics, last year at the Masterclass we had one war, as our name concerned, we have two wars ongoing. We have more than half of the world going into elections, including what remains the only superpower in the world system. And at the same time, Europe is going to elections. So if we can start with the big picture of the country Europe.
I'll start to try and answer the question by going back to the world that I encountered when I went to Brussels as Commissioner back in 2014, when the EU, I think, the institutions, the Commission, saw that the competition was between the EU and the United States. And up until the crisis, in terms of our economy and our heft in the world, the EU and the US were about the same size. Before the crisis, the EU economy was slightly bigger than the United States. And if you look at financial services, which was the area I was responsible for, the European banking sector was more profitable than the United States banking sector. So come forward 10 years to today, none of that is true anymore. The gap between the EU and the US has opened up, in my view, to an alarming degree. And it feels to me that it's going to continue increasing unless we in Europe do something radically different. So that's a first point. Second point, I think, so in the Commission, once a week, all the commissioners meet in the college to discuss what's going on. So I only had 2 years, because we then had this thing called Brexit, and I went home, back to London. But in my time, in 2 years, I don't remember a single discussion about China. We talked about Greece quite a lot at that time. China, not once. And I mentioned that as an example, because the European system at that time, and I think still, is a very inward-looking system. And I think it was complacent. And I think that since the wall came down in '89, I think we in Europe thought the future belonged to Europe. And the way that in the Commission that translated itself is people believed the future was open markets, free trade, underpinned by common regulation, rules set that the whole world would abide by, and with that way we'd get the Chinese in, and that Europe would use the rules as a way of projecting its power around the world. And in Brussels, because it's full of people who make rules, they thought that Brussels was going to win that competition through setting the rules that the rest of the world would follow. I think regulation is not now an area of cooperation. I think it's now an area of competition. And I think the best example I can think of is in the green transition. Europe, my friends in Europe thought Europe was going to win the green transition by setting the rules that the rest of the world would follow. And instead what we're seeing is the United States, for example, and the Chinese are going their own way. And so the first thing I want to say to you as business leaders is that I think the situation we face in Europe, both for economic reasons and also for political security reasons, is extremely serious. And I think the normal response for a long time in Brussels has been, it'll be business as usual. We'll just keep going. We'll just make a little change here, a little change there. It'll be okay. We don't need to change fundamentally. I think we do need to change fundamentally. And I think the other factor we have to throw in is all our governments have no money. Okay, so I can talk best about the UK. The UK, we cannot borrow anymore, and we cannot tax anymore, because our citizens have reached the limit of what they're prepared to pay. And this is the same in all our countries. So everyone talks about populism in Europe as though this is just the action of some bad, nasty people. There's a reason that this is happening in all our countries, is that there are quite a lot of people who feel they've missed out in life, in society, in wealth, and they're angry. And the people who kind of run our countries keep responding to their anger basically by telling them that they're very nasty, bad, stupid, unpleasant people, and we wish they'd go away. If you think what the nature of some of these right-wing parties are, these are not, I think, parties that are instinctively pro-markets, pro-open borders, in favour of free trade, supporters of big business. Yeah, innovation, yeah, not so interested. Yeah, they're not very interested. And I think they're likely to be more protectionist, more inward-looking, a bit more like old-fashioned, I mean, going back a long time, like peasant parties. So there may be opportunities for domestic businesses in individual country markets, but I don't think these are going to be big outward-looking free trade political movements. I do think that Europe will become more of a fortress Europe. I think we're going to become more protectionist in response to what is going to happen in the United States. To me, that means growth. Growth is our only way out of these problems. And this is where I think business has got such an important role to play. I think for quite a long time, business has been quite defensive in how it thinks about itself, how it talks about itself. Some of that in financial services has been to do with the reaction to the financial crash. But generally, business has become, particularly big business, more embarrassed in talking about profit, more embarrassed in talking about growth. And I just have a very simple view that if we don't have any growth, we are not going to be able to pay for our defence, we won't pay for our ageing population, we're not going to be able to pay for how we're going to deal with migration. I mean, migration is not going to go away as a problem. I mean, I personally think we're at the beginning of the problem. So all of these things are going to require money. Meanwhile, in Brussels, we have a machine that, in my view, the centre of gravity is sort of anti-business. Now, I'm exaggerating and simplifying, but the people who draw up the rules in Brussels, none of them have worked in business, none of them are interested in business. A lot of them think businessmen are fundamentally just trying to make money and break rules, and if you're a big businessman, you're like a bad person.
In Brussels, law, bureaucracy, regulation takes.
Yeah, it's a matter of that. Totally. And so my basic point on regulation and business, I think in every country, business needs to stand up and say, you talk about growth and competitiveness, Brussels or your own government, but you're not really doing anything that's going to make it easier for us to be able to grow and become more competitive. I have not heard a single conversation here in Delphi or anywhere in Europe when they talk about competitiveness and growth. I have not heard a single policymaker mention the word regulation. And I think we have a massively over-regulated financial sector in Europe. We're heavily dependent on the banks for our finance. All our banks have got capital tied up because of risk in the wake of the crisis. And again, my basic view, the crisis was now 16 years ago. We did face, obviously, a threat, a danger there about financial instability. I would argue the biggest threat we face now to financial stability is the lack of growth. So our policymakers shouldn't be thinking we're constantly stuck in 2008. It's 2024. The world has changed. We have pressures on all our frontiers, but Brussels is still acting as though it's 2008. I think all our countries and Europe needs to have a higher risk appetite. And unless we have a higher risk, and what we've got is a system where our politicians have surrendered responsibility to the regulators. The regulators are technocrats and defensive in their mindset, and we now have a structural problem.
There was a discussion around the lack of risk appetite in Europe, and I think that's something that historically dates back from World War II, because eventually Europe was largely devastated. We had the winners and the losers of the war, but practically Europe in its entirety was devastated, right? So in this regard, I think that actually was somehow included in the European institutions that were formed in the 50s or the 60s, like that risk of appetite, right? So going back to the very good point you made about bonds, about European bonds and about the risk of appetite, I was wondering, how do you see that changing on the one hand in the future? Because we have been having that discussion about bonds to fund common security and defense, bonds to fund the energy crisis, but none of this has happened. And I'm really wondering whether, you see that changing in Europe, and maybe a second question on that. Wouldn't it be that if we had a bond that would fund our common defense and security, wouldn't that be an implied, let's say, confession in a sort of way that we can have that common defense and security? So I think it works the other way around. We first have to solve the common defense and security issue, and then we have to see how we're going to finance that. But I think that would be a very good reason to start discussing about the European bonds, like the common financing of projects of common goals. So I would like to see your view on that one.
The whole issue of enlargement of the EU is linked to this question of, can you have some integration, and then can you address questions like bonds? Because fundamentally, I think the centre of gravity of Europe is going to move to the east. Okay, we've all thought of it as being Belgium, Luxembourg, Strasbourg kind of place.
True.
And I think that with what's happening in the Ukraine, with what we're seeing with Poland, who is becoming a big security player and has had quite good economic growth, my own best guess, and it's only a guess, and I'm not involved anymore, is that Ukraine will come into the EU. And I think that, there are massive problems with that. But I think if things go badly in Ukraine, I think emotionally the European Union will want to take Ukraine in. We've got Albania, we've got Moldova, we've got, I think, Montenegro, they're all queuing up. And so all of those countries are not going to be able to be integrated in a simple, clear way. So, i.e., we're going to have a more varied approach to different countries, I think, with different kinds of membership.
I would like to pinpoint two of the subjects you actually mentioned that were very interesting. The first one is the mindset of what entrepreneurship is about. I don't know if you are all familiar with the test that they did to 5-year-old kids. They asked from different countries to draw what an entrepreneur is. And in the States, for example, they drew a very nice, thin, beautiful man holding money and giving it to people with skyscrapers. In Turkey, there were factories, and people were entering, and from the other side, they would exit with money on their hand. Now in Greece, they designed a very fat man with his feet on the people and keeping the money in the pockets. And it was devastating because being an entrepreneur is about creativity, it's about freedom, it's about collaborating and co-creating. So I think education should be the main way to get out of this, to start understanding that calculated risks are necessary for the next day, for growth. And the second thing I would like to pinpoint is what you said about immigration. I completely agree with you. I think we are in the beginning, and I will connect it with technology. Because as technology advances, and the countries that have the ability, the money, the infrastructure to integrate with this new technology will create a bigger gap with the countries that cannot. So guess what will happen? More immigration, more inequality, and I really don't see anyone caring about this inequality that's going to happen, and the countries that are in the powerful side will face the problem of immigration further. So how do we challenge this as humanity? We need suddenly all together to be in the same page, which has never happened, because the differences that are there and the history and so on.
So I'm a British conservative, which basically means your view of the world is often quite pessimistic, and you think everything's getting worse. I mean, that's what a British conservative is. But I can paint a more optimistic picture about entrepreneurship. So if I think about my own country, so I think we've been making employment in public companies, our big public quoted companies, they're definitely becoming less entrepreneurial in the UK. They're becoming more bureaucratic. And people who used to want to go and work, for instance, in banking, they don't want to go and work in banking. And so some bits of areas of the economy that were more entrepreneurial 20 years ago, I think are becoming less entrepreneurial. But the number of young people leaving university, trying to set up their own business in their 20s, that is definitely increasing. So I think that the optimistic bit on entrepreneurism is our young people. And I don't know about Greece, but in Britain, definitely there's a trend towards people not wanting to work for big corporates, taking a risk, setting something up, running something from their own house, trying different things.
It's the same here.
So that I think is encouraging.